All right, let's get started. So again, this is equity-based design and practices, disrupting our biases. My name is Shalini Agrawal, and I am the Director of Programs for Open Architecture Collaborative and Pathways to Equity, which is a program of Open Architecture Collaborative. My background, a little bit about myself, I'm trained in architecture with extensive background in community engagement. I have over 2 decades of doing community engagement, community-based design. And what you are going to be hearing about today is really based on that experience of working in communities. This is, I think, an example of not theory to practice, but practice to theory. So actually from this learning, really saw the need to bridge the knowledge information gap, if you will, and created these programs, which I'll speak a little bit more in the presentation. And, so much of what we believe in is experiential learning. So not just listening, but actually doing. So we will definitely be inviting you to practice what we're going to be discussing today. I'm joined today by Ashley Rodriguez. Ashley, want to do a quick intro?
Hi. Yeah, so I've been with Shalini about 2 years ago. I've started my equity journey since, and I just graduated with the BArch, so I am finally starting my journey to practice. And will always be here with her. Thank you.
So any questions, support, please message Ashley or myself. We'll do our best to meet that, but let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so we did some introductions. Kira Antoine may be joining us a little later. She's the other person on our team, has been really helping with behind the scenes work of bringing this to you today as well. So just a quick session overview. This, as I mentioned, will be an interactive session. We ask that you have maybe something to write with. We'll be asking you to write a few things down and reflect on a few things. So just can be a scrap of paper, anything. So just a heads up in advance. You will be, so an introduction that we just are going through. We're going to do a land reflection. We also believe in setting what we call setting common ground and sharing language, really not making assumptions about what we know and what we don't know. We'll talk about bias and then really contextualize that in equity, like how bias influences equity in our practices. And then really look towards like leaving you with some reflections of how you might do this between today and next week. So the objectives are to, our objectives today will be to contextualize some of the language that we actually often hear quite a bit, but really kind of think about what these words mean. Bring an awareness to our biases and how they impact the work we do. And then really also not just bring an awareness, but really start to slow down the process and notice and disrupt them. Really, and then the goal is really to shift our practices towards more equity and inclusion by taking personal steps towards personal responsibility. So really this is about how do we start with ourselves first before we actually think about the broader context of the profession. But first I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush people who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. I pay respects to the elders, past and present, and I ask that we take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, and migration and settlement that bring us here today. I know you are all probably in the same area, but we have a link here for you to just share that will be dropped in the chat. Ashley, if you want to drop that link in. And please share which lands that you are calling from. And you can drop it in the chat. So if you're new to this map, it's like you, what I really appreciate about this map is that it's not mapping in the way that we know, it's actually mapping in the way that the people moved on the land, which I really think is so beautiful because it's not with these distinct lines, it's actually overlapping circles. So yeah, thank you for, and I also think like as a profession that has an inherent relationship to the land, we really need to think about the land and the original owners and the history, the really, you know, the way back history of the land and who have been the original caretakers and who are still here today. So I see unceded Ohlone land. So Santa Clara County, I believe, is, you know, if you look on this map, you'll find exactly the original owners of the land. If you, because I'm sharing screen, I'm not able to do it, but if you can take a look and see, and same with Redwood, I think Redwood City as well is probably in that area. I see Estkano lands. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. Ama Mutsun tribal band, Ohlone, Tamien, Ohlone, Muwekma, Ohlone, Tamien, Ohlone, Muwekma, Miwok, Coastal Miwok, Grattan, Rancherio, Wapo, Confederated Villages of the Lisjan. Yes, thank you so much. I think it's, again, because this is something that was never really brought to our attention. I also want to remind us that we still occupy the land, that this has not been returned back. Obispeño, thank you. Okay, take a breath there and just notice, you know, that this is what we're here today is to notice what we don't notice. And so from here, I'm just going to really take us to, you know, thank you for filling out the intake form. You all, we got 34 respondents, so it feels like almost all of you filled it out, which is really great. And this is what came out. So there was a question, what were some of the hopes that you wanted to get out of the webinar series? And I'd say by far, the first one here was the one that many of you shared, a greater understanding and awareness of equity issues and needs. This was also followed by understanding inequity and racism in the built environment. And then also like engaging in difficult conversations about racial equity. So not just, we really are excited to see this, not just wanting to understand and become aware, but also how to have discussions about it. And so we're really, this is very much aligned with what we're interested in as well. This was also wanting to recognize biases and then develop shared understanding. So a lot of what you are sharing your desire for today's webinar, and actually our two-part webinar, is really a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So, and you're encouraged to respond in the chat with reflections throughout the session. You know, I also wanted to remind you that there was concern about like doing things the right or the wrong way. And I really wanted to invite you to have this as a space of learning. That actually, you know, I started with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that centuries ago, we get used to doing things a certain way and knowing things, and here we are today, and that we are really relearning new things, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. So because of this space of learning, we're asking, we're going to just share a few community practices, recognizing that we're online and learning online can be challenging, but we ask that you listen actively and compassionately. Try to understand. We'll be introducing some new concepts maybe to you, so just be open to new concepts. Self-care, you know, access needs in order to be present. We know it's really hard in the virtual room, and do your best to be present with us. Every voice is important. We all have something to contribute, and it's okay if it's imperfect, right? So this isn't about having a perfect response or perfect thought, but actually, just feeling that what you have to say is important. Stay engaged, remove distractions as best as possible. We'll be together for now about an hour and 15 minutes. So, and then think beyond binaries. So this is really not about a right or a wrong or this or that. It's really thinking about the spectrum of options and multiple points of view. So those are some of the practices. And we do community practices because they help us create space for conversations. Like one of the things about having conversations around racial equity is making space for these conversations. So community practices help us to do that. And these help us to talk about topics that we usually don't make space to talk about. And it can get uncomfortable. So I really want to emphasize that the discomfort is actually part of the learning. And these are some ways in which we can hold that discomfort. And in our webinar, we're going to be doing a 2-part webinar that really is more of a beginning for all of this. But if we go into deeper learning, then this allows us to encourage people to show up as their true self and hold each other accountable for our actions throughout our learning. And I'm going to, I want to calibrate expectations. That's a lot to do in an hour and a half today and an hour and a half next week. Just wanted to calibrate our expectation that this is an introduction to understanding bias and its impacts. And it's really about prompting curiosity, noticing and looking beyond the norms of practice. And I really need to emphasize that this is not a replacement. This is not a replacement to the investment of time and energy needed to change the status quo, especially as it relates to inequities that have endured over time. So I really want to emphasize that we're not going to be making things completely new and different, but what we are hoping to do is actually to create a practice of noticing how things can change. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'm going to ask you to, okay, so, we're calibrating expectations, and we're going to be learning some new things, and we're asking you to shift the status quo. So I'm going to ask you to grab that piece of paper and pen. We're going to do a quick exercise here of just literally it'll take us a minute and a half. Just going to get my timer ready. So on your sheet of paper, I want you to, I'm going to give you, let's say 20 seconds to write your name. Just write your name, 20 seconds, ready and go. And you can write it multiple times, however you want to do it, no right or wrong. And okay, stop. All right, so I want you to do the exact same thing, but now do it with your non-dominant hand. So I'm going to give you a little bit more time. I'll give you 30 seconds. So write your name again, but with your non-dominant hand. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. And stop. So in the chat, tell me what that was like for you. Messy, slow, uncomfortable, awkward, cartoon, foreign, new learning with my lefty, a little awkward with the non-dominant hand, illegible, had to be more intentional, needed more concentration. Anyone else? Messy. Needed to focus, more concentration, focus. I had to move the pad entirely. Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Almost unreadable. Thank you for being so honest. Yeah, you know, whatever. So I just want to acknowledge that new learning can be this. So something that we can intellectualize is like, oh, I get this. I get my name. I understand how to spell and write my name. But actually, when we do it with new and different muscles, it can be all of these things that are in the chat. And so I really find this a powerful exercise because intellectually it's like, yeah, I can do that, I can learn that, yeah, I got that, right? But I also just want to remind us all, like when we take on new learning and new practices, like even something as common as our name that we may write every day, when we just use different muscles, how it requires us to slow down. So it's really a metaphor to me for learning, and also like what you feel when you do this new learning. Like the perfectionist in me gets super frustrated, right? So like, oh, okay, that's probably going to be the way it is for all learning for me as well. So just noticing too, when something new is introduced, like how do you feel about it? Like what happens? So yeah, just wanted to start us off with that and reminding ourselves that, you know, as we're going into new learning, just remembering that, you know, what it feels like for you. All right, so I'm going to reshare my screen and we're going to talk a little bit about like who we are before we jump into our learning. So okay, so I introduced myself from Pathways to Open Architecture Collaborative, and I wanted to just give a little bit of background because so much of our, you know, our mission and our vision and our values are really reflected in the work we do. So Open Architecture Collaborative is a larger network that connects people who are interested in addressing systemic inequity in the built environment. And Pathways to Equity is a program of Open Architecture Collaborative that is committed to centering equity and racial justice in architecture, design, planning, all the practices that influence the built environment. Our goal is to create transformative learning experiences, shifting the field towards anti-racism and equitable outcomes. We do this through training programs for professionals who impact the built environment, firm consulting, and customized trainings and webinars such as this. Pathways to Equity trainings are grounded in community engaged design. And as I mentioned earlier, it's based on what I felt was missing from what I was taught in school. So these are some of our guiding values, you know, that kind of direct our work. So we're guided by values such as accessibility, equity, diversity, restorative justice, and inclusion. And we also don't feel that we have answers. We actually have a lot of questions. So we ask ourselves questions, and sometimes one question will take an entire year, but we are guided by questions of, you know, do these values, who are we not hearing from and why? How do we embrace what we don't know? What is needed to heal the harm? So really hard questions for us, but really kind of help us center us in this work. Pathways to Equity was founded in 2018, and since that time we have had 10 interdisciplinary cohorts, both online and in person, over 300 alumni. We've done 7 projects with community partners, and we've done equity cohorts with a government partner, nonprofits, and architecture firms. So really more focused equity training, and we're really proud of being acknowledged for our process with the NOMA NAACP Seed Award for Justice, Equity, diversity and inclusion. So, and in this webinar series, I will be sharing some of the learning with you. So what you'll be experiencing today is very much a lot of what we do in our trainings. So let's get started now. So we're going to start with some shared language. So as I'm going to read some words, and as I review the definitions, please feel free to use the chat and write anything that stands out to you, even a word in the definition. Part of this is just noticing things that maybe we haven't noticed before. So let's see. So the first word, and these are words we hear quite often. So diversity. So diversity is the collection of differences and similarities of a group. Diversity is not a person, but a culture we create. Culture, thank you. Nice. Solidarity, not a person, but a culture. Community. Create, nice, thank you. Opportunity. This is great, thank you. I'm going to keep going. Inclusion. Inclusion is accepting and embedding differences, making each individual a part of the whole. Another way to think about inclusion is that it produces a context in which everyone present has the opportunity to make a meaningful and valued contribution and experience a sense of belonging to the group as they are, who they are. Whole, part of a whole, meaningful, valuable. Each individual a part of the whole. Open for everyone, embedding, belonging, sense of belonging, respect, being seen. Wow, thank you. These are great. Acceptance, listening, everyone present, sense of belonging, aware. Great. We'll keep going. Thank you. Equity. We hear this word quite a bit. These are the definitions that we like to reference. Equity is the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. Another definition of equity. Equity is a situation in which all people or groups are given access to the number and types of resources needed so as to achieve equal results, and differs from equality, which focuses on equal distribution of resources rather than equal results. Just and fair inclusion. All can participate, equal results, participate, equal results, dignity. What everyone needs as opposed to the same. Yes, thank you, David. We're going to show a little diagram in a moment. Uplift, access. Yeah, we have a little, also, you may know this already, but we find this really helpful in really making a distinction between equality and equity. So on the left, equality is when each individual or group is given the same resources or opportunities. So you can see in this diagram, and please know that this is a little diagram cartoon, and it is meant to convey, it is not an absolute of what this is, but it really is a visual. So you can see equal resources, meaning the same size ladder. And then equity is getting recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates exact resources and opportunities needed to reach equal outcomes. And you can see that this is an interesting diagram because it's still imperfect. The tree is leaning, but I think this is a nice visual to understand that, you know, I also want to say that equality can be a first step towards equity. So I don't want to discount equality. However, I really want us to kind of make a distinction between the two. So, you know, this is about equity. And I also recognize that equity by definition is not a one size fits all. So even this learning will land in different ways depending on, depending on where you are in your learning. So, okay. All right, so that's some beginning of some shared language. And I'm going to ask that you now we're going to just do a guided visualization before we get started diving in deeper. So just sit back for a moment. I'm just going to read a little visualization and so just sit back and listen for like a minute. Okay, so here's the scenario. You're late for a meeting at a job site, at a site. And, but you decide to stop for coffee on your way there. And as you're in line for coffee, a couple in front of you sees that you're in a rush and lets you go ahead of them. So you thank them and you're so grateful and you get your favorite drink and you take it from the person behind the counter, the barista, who has actually spelled your name right this time. You grab your coffee and you're on your way now to this meeting and you're now even a little bit more late. And you enter the meeting and the whole team is there and the meeting has already started. So you're looking around the room and you find a seat next to the architect. And even though you've arrived late, the developer gives you a smile and catches you up on what you've missed. Later, you're taking a tour of the site, which is the renovation of a series of affordable housing buildings. And as you walk through one of the buildings, you pass a current resident who is waiting for the elevator. Okay, so let's just pause here for a moment and reflect. So when you were standing in line to get your coffee, was the couple who was standing in front of you a same-sex couple? How about the barista who gave you your coffee? Was the barista an elder? And then when you stepped into the meeting, was the architect a woman? And then the developer who was in the meeting, was the developer a person of color or Black or Latino, Latinx? What was the gender makeup of the people in the room? Was there anyone in a wheelchair? How many men and women were in that room? And was the current resident who was waiting at the elevator white? So what was that like for you? What surprised you? Feel free to share in the chat. A lot of unconscious bias coming up for me, right? Mm-hmm. No one looked like me in that entire exchange. Wow. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I don't notice. I think I visualize what I tend to see. Yeah, most in these spaces. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for being so. I do too. I mean, I am trained in architecture and I don't even visualize myself in that room. I did not think about all those questions when you read the scenario. It was quite foreign in my visualization. Thank you. I was focused on being late, but still stopping for coffee. But also visualize white people. Thank you. Everyone was white and male. Mostly no, but I mainly just imagined the last few meetings I attended. Yeah. I kept waiting for someone to call me out for arriving late. I assumed the barista was younger. I never got over the fact that I would not have stopped for coffee. Interesting. Yeah. No, so interesting things, right, that we're noticing about this, whether it's like the patterns of how we behave or who we see in the room. So, you know, I really, to me, it's like about this visualization of what our brains predict, and you know what we're used to seeing, and this is reinforced, if you will, in the news, in the media, in the profession, in history, right? Even so, I really want to say that this is kind of our brains picking, reinforcing the things that we already see and hear that are reinforced by other sources. And you are not alone. We all have implicit biases. You're not the only group of people that is interested in learning more about this and how it actually impacts the work we do. And just as it's hard to see these things, it's hard to unlearn them. So one of the things like about unlearning something, right? So the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. So the more we see this, the harder it becomes to see it, to disrupt it, I should say. Culture reflects the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of a group, community, a state, a nation. And these beliefs and values and practices have been going on for so long that we often don't see them. We're not aware of them. However, we risk reinforcing the very patterns that we're aiming to disrupt. Right? So part of this is like, we can't make a change without actually noticing what we're trying to disrupt. And this can be caused by habit, security with the familiar, excuse me, resistance to change, stereotypes, lack of awareness. I mean, can you imagine different race, gender, sexuality of any of those people in your visualization? Even now knowing what this is about, like, can you even mentally replace people in a new way and imagine how can be even hard for us to know ahead of time? Just noticing what is different can be hard for us to do, let alone doing something different. And again, remembering the handwriting exercise, right? So something that we intellectually think we can do, but actually doing it is like writing with the opposite hand. When discussing ways to shift away from inequity, we have to look at the systems that are the root cause of this source of inequity. So I'm going to share some definitions. Again, these are some ways, like, again, I like to remind myself of the words that I'm using. So bias is a disproportionate weight in favor or against an idea, thing, or person. And again, always welcome to type reflections in the chat. Implicit bias or unconscious bias, also known as unconscious bias, are implied associations or assumptions that we unknowingly hold. They are expressed automatically without conscious awareness. And I also want to say that, yes, there are biases, there are implicit biases, but not all biases are created equal. Implicit racial bias is unknowing discriminatory associations or perceptions resulting in biased thoughts or actions. So implicit racial bias is reinforced by racial stereotypes, discriminatory patterns of knowing, learning, and seeing. And so I think a lot of us are really trying to not just focus on bias and implicit bias, but how that impacts race in the work that we do. So I want to give an example of what this might look like very simply. So this is a familiar, this is a world map, and actually it's probably, if you Google world map, you might actually find this image. And we have, this is the Mercator map. It was designed as a nautical navigational tool in 1569. So it's been around for a long time. So long that we don't question it. But let me just show you. So this is the actual, this is a little animation of the actual sizes of the land. We get so used to seeing land a certain way that it's so hard for us to even imagine that these lands are different sizes. These are the actual sizes when it gets smaller. I also want to name that the minority global north is centered and considerably enlarged on this map, while the majority global south remains the same. Canada and Russia are drawn to occupy 25% of the earth when they really only take up 5%. And Africa has in the middle, and Africa is a much larger continent that we actually are used to seeing. And so, you know, again, this is based on, I would say, global north, global south, right? So and there's definitely, that has influenced how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive, and how things are quite literally centered around people who have power. Just a little bit of, this is to give you a sense of how large Africa is. Even with India, the United States, and China, it still is more than that combined landmass. So yeah, I'm curious to know, you know, to me, I'm like, why does this happen? I mean, I think I know why that happens, and who made this map and why, right? So a lot of what I'm thinking about with bias is like asking questions like, well, how did this happen and why? And so part of this is always asking those questions of the root causes, which kind of helps us to begin to disrupt our biases. And I also want to say we're all visual communicators here. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know any reflections of what this is to you, like what are you noticing, any reflections in the chat. All right, well, we'll keep going. Really along those lines of visual communication, like how we perceive information is a powerful feeder of how we actually see things. And it can leave an indelible print on our minds. And so as we kind of move towards how we practice architecture, design, and planning, how does that impact the work we do? So this is a book by Ruben Pater called The Politics of Design. And it really talks about the power of visual communication. So you are privileged. Just reading this sentence makes you part of the 85% of the world population that is literate and the 20% that understands English. Acknowledging that communication is not neutral puts everything in perspective. So just referencing the map that we just saw, communication is not neutral. It is by realizing that we are culturally biased that we can understand why communication often fails. So not just visual communication, you can imagine all the verbal communication, all the ways in which we communicate. It is culturally biased. And I'm just, Yes, thank you. I'm just going to lack of balance. I had some idea that the map was off, but not that much. I immediately jumped to the scientific. Is it more to do with visualizing space on a sphere? The projection communicates dominance of global north compared to global south, right? Thank you. White supremacy, absolutely. White supremacy colonization, right? How normalizing and centering of the global north is, even in places in the global south, right? Thank you for those reflections. So design, architecture, planning, it's political. We can't say that it's not. And so, acknowledging that communication is not neutral puts it in perspective. And so here's an example of, I wanted to just highlight this example here. We often present a vision of the future through renderings, right? That's actually what a lot of what our training is about, is like planning for the future. It's visual communication of planning of who will be here, the businesses, the people, the type of buildings, transportation. This is an area, a rendering in Oakland that is rapidly gentrifying. And so take a look at the new development. What do you see? Like, what are signifiers of new development here? Trees, rooftop trellis, rooftop access, right on. Yeah, rooftop access. Building materials, large windows, pedestrian activity, light rail, building heightened stories, bikes, right? The more you look, the more you find glass facades, new crosswalks, lack of places to gather, width of sidewalks different on both sides of the street, people, fancy crosswalks, large pane glazing, street crossing signage, almost monochromatic. Canopies over sidewalk, light rail, taller buildings, trees, right? Very clean, lack of color, sneak peek or of train or truck, right? Some representation, sterile, no art, uniform building size. Yeah, no art. I love that you're pointing out that there's no art. I love that. No wheelchair access, right? Renderings. Yeah, and you just got this from a rendering. I gave you very little information other than where it was located and this rendering. So, my question is what visuals do we reference when we do a rendering? Is it biased? What do our renderings, what do our visions of the future include and exclude? And what are the sources of these visions? As professionals who shape the built environment and kind of influence communities, who decides what to keep, what to design, what not to keep, what to redesign? Whose buildings, landscapes, and communities do we value? So this is a definition of gentrification. A process of a neighborhood change that includes economic change in historically disinvested neighborhoods by means of real estate investment and new higher income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. And this is from the Urban Displacement Project. So, this is a word we use a lot, and this to me is a very uncomfortable truth of what gentrification really means. Yeah, we can argue it for sure, but I also think like when we are using that term, that is almost like language, if you will, coded language. And this can lead to people knowing who this is for and who this is not for. So this is afraid of anyone who differed from the suburban archetype. The newcomers to the neighborhood were not only uninterested in learning anything about the incredibly dynamic place they had moved to, but ignorant of their role in destroying that dynamism. They too had gone somewhere without going anywhere. This is from Jenny Odell, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, which is also referencing Sarah Schulman, The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to the Lost Imagination. So I'm always like, within one snapshot of a rendering, we were able to see, we were able to identify these investments in a neighborhood, and for some people and maybe not for others. So really thinking about that definition of inclusion. So part of what I would ask you to think about are, what are the neighborhoods around you that have been gentrified, and what is the history of who lives there or who used to live there? Something for you to think about as you're noticing changes in communities. So a little bit, let's kind of look a little bit more of this history of gentrification and where it's sourced. So I'm sure you're familiar with redlining maps. I know you're all planners. So just a quick definition of what it is. It's in the late 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded neighborhoods into 4 categories based in large part on their racial makeup. Neighborhoods with minority occupants were marked in red, hence redlining, and considered high risk for mortgage lenders. So this is, the impact of that practice. That was, I think, a planner probably, right? I mean, maybe you all know more about the source of who was doing those red line maps. Drawing a line on a map. It was intentional. It was not by accident. And so, this is a book, Color of Law, and it outlines that, goes into a lot of detail about that history. But I just want to point out that many, the act of redlining, was the explicit purpose of redlining was racial segregation. That was the goal. And because of that, many of our national problems originate with residential segregation, and have become I would say inextricably intractable because of it. And so some examples of that is the impacts of that show up today is generational wealth. People of color, but specifically Black families, still feel the socioeconomic effects of such racist housing policies. They've missed out on one of the major ways to build wealth in this country without earning any home equity. Another impact has been environmental. Communities of color are often, they have less political power when it comes to resisting denser housing and the construction of major industry or roadways in their neighborhoods. And this can be generating more heat, and then obviously health as well. And that's another outcome of this, is that there's increased evidence that some racial and ethnic minority groups are being disproportionately affected by these red line maps through pollution, as well as also COVID and food injustice, food deserts, right? So this one act that was done in the 30s has had repercussions that show up today. So just to highlight a local example again, this is in Oakland. These are the red line maps in Oakland and Berkeley. And the lower lands here that are redlined are closer to the water. They also are more susceptible to seawater. I'm sorry, the rising, the water. I'm like forgetting the word.
Sea level rise.
Thank
Sea
you.
level rise.
Yes. Sea level rise. Thank you so much. Yes, and the climate, the impacts of climate change. And so they're closer to the water, and then, you know, they're also on the lower lands. And then as you get up, the topography here is the higher up you get, which is more of these more preserved neighborhoods. So this system of redlining has also impacted patterns of gentrification. So this purple overlay here is the areas that are being gentrified. You know, this is directly sourced from these redline maps. This is not a coincidence. I mean, it's to the line. A system of redlining produces what it was designed to produce. And without disruption, this is what we see. All right. So just, I want to take a pause. That was a lot of information. And I'm curious to know, just everyone just take a breath, just like, whew, a lot of history, a lot of language, a lot of learning. Just take a breath. And thank you for the notes here in the chat. What's standing out for you? Maybe just in the chat, like it doesn't have to be anything that's been processed, something that might be standing out for you. We have the book available. Yes, maybe a reading group there.
I have an observation that I made just like seeing the maps. I grew up in like in East Palo Alto. I don't know if you're familiar, which is on the other side of Palo Alto and separated by a freeway. And so it was really interesting to see that because I grew up in situations like that, and we never understood it growing up. It was just like, oh yeah, the nicer side of town is across the freeway. But now being older, I understand it a lot more. And I think I'm facing a difficulty because I feel like I'm also part of that gentrification problem where I'm moving into neighborhoods that I can, you know, luckily afford, but families like the ones that I grew up with can't. So it's really interesting to see and feeling like I'm a part of the problem, but also trying to help. So that was an interesting observation for me.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate that. Anyone else want to share? Can write in the chat. So yeah, I feel that planners understand the issues and need to overcome segregation, but it's so hard to convince decision makers on boards and commissions to change their thinking and push for mixed income housing. Thank you. Yeah. For me, I have noted the change in my appreciation for gentrification from something that was seen as good to something seen as good to something that I now view as sad. Yeah. I also want to really say that gentrification is not all bad. I just really want to say, like, who's part of the conversation? Right? Let's like notice. I think people want improved neighborhoods, but for whom and by whom, right? So, you know, really asking those questions and more complicated. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like who are we hearing from and who are we not hearing from? I'm always about asking questions. As planners, we cannot be apolitical. We cannot just be technocrats. Yeah. Gentrification without displacement, right? It's hard to sit with these information. So, which is why, like, take a breath, like notice what you're noticing in your body. Like, like, I think that's important to sit with those discomforts, if you will, or truths, or whatever emotions coming up. I do this talk often, and I'm always really, I have this sense of sadness, but I'm like, okay, that means I'm feeling something about this, as opposed to just masking it. So it's really important to allow ourselves to have the feelings we feel about it. I've been reflecting a lot about the amount of privilege and homogeneity in the community I practice and reside in. Yeah, thank you. We will give you some reflections for this week to actually notice things like that. So, all right, well, let's keep going. We're going to, really make the connection of like why equity and in this work. So we need to think about equity, because designing without equity is designing inequity. So this is a way for me to say, like, our biases are our practices, our biases, our patterns, our implicit racial biases are so reinforced that unless we make a conscious effort to center equity in our practices, we will continue to reinforce the previous patterns, which are, inequitable. And it requires dedication and commitment from all of us. So yes, I'm hearing this sense of like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. I have to reflect on this. And I truly believe that every single one of you can make an impact. I wouldn't do this work if I didn't believe that. I really want to say that. I do this because I believe in the capacity for each individual to make, to be a change, to make a change. And equity is a journey. It's not a destination. So from here, maybe you're in the beginning, maybe you've gone a little farther, but we have to just remember, like the handwriting practice, it's a practice. It's not a destination. We are continually together on this journey to really notice the things that haven't changed. And it's not going to be as easy as like changing it overnight, but it's actually this journey together that you all are on. And I just want to also acknowledge that you all here at MGroup doing this together is great. You're all receiving this information. And now I hope that you can't unlearn this now, now that you know. So one of the things, a really good place to start is to think about how to disrupt biases. And it requires a practice of noticing. We have to make a concerted effort, a collective effort to see what we don't see, to name what we don't name, and to understand what we don't understand. And to do a very, very simple way of doing this is to slow down. So I will go back to the very beginning when you wrote your name and some of you said you had to slow down. That is such a powerful way for us to start disrupting our biases, is just noticing when we default to similar patterns, behaviors, thinking, and just even personally. And I really, for this week, I invite you to just notice. I mean, really just have a practice of noticing. Another quote here that I wanted to share. Unlike the dams that interrupt a river's flow, and these barriers, and I'm really calling the barriers as biases, are not concrete. They are mental structures that can be dismantled through practices of attention. It is with acts of attention that we decide who to hear, who to see, and who in our world has agency. In this way, attention forms the ground, not just for love, but for ethics. Disrupting our biases requires us to build a practice of noticing, and we can't disrupt our norms without first noticing them. So shifting our familiar patterns requires that we learn from others. And to think beyond the parameters of what we know. And even in this place of learning from others and thinking that we can learn from others, we will never understand each other's individual life experience. I really also want to acknowledge that you won't always know what people experience. So disrupting biases is an ongoing conscious effort. Building relationships is a key to doing that, right? And then honoring lived experience is the key to building more inclusion in relationships. So for this week, I would love for you to think about these small things, and we'll send this in a follow-up email. Think of disrupting biases as a micro commitment. You're not going to be like, okay, we're going to change everything all at once, right? But really taking some small steps, and it could be just with ourselves. So appreciate the unique. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be verbal. You could just notice the unique. So value the differences in other stories and ideas. Consider how different perspectives can shift your process. So this could be as simple, so for me, I have a name that is different. And so I've become very aware of like noticing names, probably because it's my own experience. And so I'm always really interested in people's names. And so that's a small thing, right? A micro commitment. That doesn't mean that I need to know everything about everyone, but something as simple as a name can be a really great way to appreciate the unique. Amplify others, help underrepresented voices be heard. So this can be really, again, a micro commitment might just be like asking someone a question, like, did I leave something out, right? Asking, making space, again, slowing down the process of how we might do things. I actually think these are really great ways to practice at home with our partners, with our family, with people, It's actually a really great way to start there, is to amplify, the voices that we don't usually hear. Rethink routine. Do things differently, right? Try something different. And it could be as simple as like, okay, I'm going to start my morning in a different way. I'm going to get myself off of social media after a certain time. I mean, it doesn't all have to be work related. I think it's like, how can you start with yourself first? And again, going back to that handwriting, like, what do you notice when you change up something? And then open up, acknowledge not knowing, but do the work to learn. So this, I think, is something that will often happen with new learning, is that sometimes we expect other people to teach us, especially when it comes to different lived experiences. Y'all are educated people. So I invite you to be curious and do your own work when you don't know something, instead of asking someone to explain it to you. So this, I can say an example. I had a student, I also teach, and a student that was celebrating Ramadan, and I unfortunately brought food for a class party, and I didn't know about this student's celebration. And so rather, kind of learned that this was acknowledged that I didn't know, and then really did some personal research about it, and really made a note to like, okay, notice when things are happening during certain times of the year, and that not everyone celebrates in the same way that I think they do. So yeah, I'm always really acknowledging what I don't know, and always trying to do the learning. But I say these small examples because it starts with these tiny examples. Please, we have 1 week. I would love for you all to think about like one small thing. It can be just one of these 4 things that you might try out. What can you make a commitment to for a week? What can you make a commitment to where you see differences, how you can move up or move back, where you can change the status quo? And again, I would even think about your daily routine, right? And how do you acknowledge not knowing something? Let's see. Let me stop sharing for a moment. All right, just tracking my time for a moment. Let me just see. I'm going to copy and paste those in the chat. And I think, Ashley, I wonder if we could do some breakout rooms for maybe you set up some breakout rooms for 3 people, roughly 3 people, and I'll just copy. So just something to think about maybe in your breakout room is, let me just copy this. Some ideas that are coming up for you. And yeah, just you know, after what you just heard, so I gave you the context as it relates to architecture, planning, design. And now I'm asking you to think about it first personally. Next week, we will be talking about how this applies to the profession. But I ask that you might think of something personally, right? It starts with ourselves first and how we engage in this work before we can actually bring it to the workplace. So Ashley, you give me a thumbs up. Are you good to go?
Yes.
Okay.
I will open all the rooms right
Okay,
now.
so we'll give you, let's say, about 8 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes. So yeah, just have a conversation about what is what's a micro commitment that you can say out loud to these few people in your breakout room. Right, a little bit of accountability. All right, and make it easy. Make it something that you know you can do, even if it's just for one day. All right, we'll see you in about 7 minutes, 8 minutes. Let me pause the recording.
To me.
No, I think it will close automatically. So.
Oh, I see.
but
I didn't
thank
realize
you.
that.
Thank you for being on time. Early, actually.
Those of us who are more concerned about getting coffee when you're late for a meeting, we're all coming back. What's up, Tom?
Hello.
Right, I think everyone's back. Yes, okay. Well, I want to just take a moment to pause and see if anyone wants to share their micro commitment or even just what it was to reflect with your colleagues. Yeah, anything that is coming up for you that you'd like to share would take a few minutes.
Do you want us to share in the chat or?
Actually, you can unmute. That would be great since
Okay.
we have a little extra time.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I have been really cooped up because COVID cases have been surging so much. So I'm going to make a point to try to just get out more this week and observe the people that I see and try to be less judgmental of people, especially who aren't wearing masks.
Yeah, thank you.
The one for me, Shalini, that really struck home was amplify others. We're working on a lot of housing policy work right now, and we go to a lot of public meetings and we get a lot of public testimony. And I think there's a lot of community members who could use support in making sure their message is really heard and understood by the decision makers.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was recognizing that kind of we're all feeling maybe different incarnations of some of the same challenges in our work and kind of where we serve, the types of demographics that we encounter, the kind of people who come to our engagement doesn't mean that that's the only people we need to listen to. So kind of a big reminder of how to push and go and listen to others and find where those voices are who aren't being involved in the process, while still acknowledging that all that's really hard in the system that we're in. So the answers weren't there yet, but it was still like that intention to start that process.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
So I don't know if this was the purpose of the exercise, but my micro commitment had nothing to do with work. It was more personal,
Yeah.
where it was just that I need to schedule time to exercise every day.
Yes.
So it's probably nothing that relates to other people, but just me sort of changing something that I do. So I don't know how that helps, but.
Thank you, Ranu, for actually naming that. I think part of it for me is, and the reason I think that it matters how that relates to work is that if we can't change it in ourselves, how can we change it in our work? Right? If we can't make a commitment to make a change in our routine or anything else, to me, that's a really great way to practice. And it's not necessarily about like, oh, I'm getting, yes, you're going to benefit from more exercise, but what happens when you make those changes? It's like, like with any practice, what happens, right? Whenever we make a change, I don't know if any of you do New Year's resolutions, what happens, right? When we try to make a change, right? It becomes hard. It becomes disheartening. We don't want to do it anymore. I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I don't have to say some of you might be like really great with them, but it's like, it's accountability, it's ongoing, it's hard work, right? So if those are the things that are hard for me when I do something for myself, how can I also maintain that level of commitment with my work? Right. And so what are the ways in which I maintain that level of commitment? Is it like finding an accountability partner? Is it writing about it? Is it having compassion? Is it, finding smaller ways to do things as opposed to like, I want to do one big thing. I want to, make these grand, my partner's always like, I want to lose weight this year. I'm like, how about like a micro commitment, right? Right. Like, how about like, we're just going to eat healthy once a week or something, right? Like, so it's really making something that's really big and taking it in bite-sized things. And how do we actually, when we do it with ourselves, it sets us up to be able to do it in our work. So thank you, Ranu. That to me is also very valuable. Yes, your internal practices reflect externally for sure. Anyone else want to share? And also fine to do it in the workplace. I don't want to say that that's also, but I also want to encourage you to think about it in two ways. Anyone else have something?
I might just share that, sometimes when some of these difficult topics come up, it's really easy to allow some of the emotions to really be felt and to not observe them. And so I think a distinguishing factor for me that has helped me to sort of recognize those is to try and step back and observe those emotions, observe those feelings instead of just feeling them. Because in that moment, you might have a reaction that you're not really aware of, you're not recognizing. So, and this is a practice that, you know, you can take all kinds of places, but intentionally here, I think observing those rather than just experiencing those.
Oh, thank you for naming that. Yeah, I think sitting with the discomfort of how we feel, you know, if there's something, a new feeling that comes up that's new, sitting with that and noticing like, wow, I'm feeling this way. And where does that coming from? Yeah, thank you for naming that. Next week, we're going to talk about we're going to dive in deeper. And we are going to actually be sitting with, you know, what does it mean to be uncomfortable in the systems that we have created that are inequitable and quite frankly can be oppressive. So yeah, thank you for naming that. Maybe one more share. Anyone else have a burning, like want to say something? Rethink your routine, maybe speak up.
Yeah, I highlighted open up. I was really like reflecting on how I think our sudden shift in a workplace to a more digital environment, with everyone being remote, separated, or in person, masked, or I think it's just it can be more difficult to have these essential conversations. So I want to challenge myself in the next week to recognize how my practice has shifted and how I can really make sure that those difficult conversations are had with my colleagues. And I'm just very grateful for a firm that advocates for really important changes that need to happen. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great way for us to close today. Again, I really want to thank you so much. I think all of you who, 34 people filled out, and I think all of you, I think 100% of you filled out the intake, and thank you for this patience with us. We have a hard time delivering information in one session, which is why we are intentional about doing it in two. We will be reflecting on the things that we talked about today and reflecting on the micro practices. And it's okay. To me, practice is practice. Practice is not about perfection. Practice is about practice. So do something this week and try it out. And it's about it not being perfect. So, and we will reflect on it next week. And yeah, I'm excited for you all to give it a try, and we'll be diving into systems thinking. Like, how is all of this now related to, so this practice of noticing and practice of seeing how things have been designed inequitably. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into systems thinking. So please join next week, because this is definitely designed to be a two-parter. One supports the other. And I look forward to seeing you next week. So I'll hang back for any questions, but otherwise I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.